Welcome, everybody, to episode 144 of the OLA Adult Ed Faith Formation Weekly Gospel Podcasts. This is the fourth Sunday of Lent, known as Laetare Sunday. We are in the Gospel of John, specifically John chapter 9, verses 1 to 41. And as I mentioned, when we entered into Lent and entered into the 6 gospel readings that we'll hear proclaimed during Lent, 4 of the 6 are quite lengthy, 35, 40 verses or more. So for those, I decided, rather than do kind of a verse-by-verse sort of unpacking, that because of their length and because of the nature of this podcast being 15, 20 minutes, for those lengthier ones, we're going to take a look at 4 or 5 aspects of each reading, bring those to the surface, and kind of use them as a background and a backdrop. So when you hear the actual verses proclaimed on Sunday, you can put each of those verses against this background and backdrop, and hopefully it'll bring out the meaning of those verses a little bit more. So that's kind of the tack that we're using for these lengthier readings in Lent. Not a verse-by-verse unpacking, but 4 or 5 main aspects from which you can take a look at the verses when they're proclaimed. I mentioned this is Laetare Sunday. Traditionally, the fourth Sunday of Lent is always Laetare Sunday. Laetare means rejoice. And what we're rejoicing in is the hope we have in Jesus and Him being able to heal us, and the hope we have in the kingdom of God. And it kind of parallels a similar Sunday in Advent, and that is Gaudete Sunday. So Advent has Gaudete Sunday, Lent has Laetare Sunday. Both Sundays really calls us to rejoice, calls us to hope in what Jesus has done for us and what we have to look forward to. And in each case, we see a change in the liturgical color and a change in the priest's vestments, both for Gaudete in Advent and Laetare here in Lent. The liturgical colors and the color of the vestments go from the penitential purple to rose, which looks like pink, it's actually rose, to signify rejoicing and hope. So fourth Sunday of Lent, Laetare Sunday, John 9, verses 1 to 41, where Jesus heals the man born blind. Now, when you hear this proclaimed on Sunday, and if you're familiar with it, you know that a good chunk of this passage is taken up in not only Jesus healing this man born blind, but a back and forth between the man and the Jewish religious leaders, okay? But again, we're going to pick out 4 or 5 aspects of the entire passage and kind of bring them out and maybe see some things or consider some things or learn some things maybe we didn't know before. So with that in place, here's aspect number 1. It talks about Jesus as he passed by. Now, again, as we've mentioned so many times in these gospel podcasts, when the Holy Spirit inspires one of the gospel writers to drop in a detail that he otherwise wouldn't need to drop in, or to phrase something a certain way, he does so for a reason. And because there's a reason behind it, like I've always said, it's incumbent upon us to find out what this reason is. So John starts his passage by indicating Jesus has passed by, okay? And you might say, okay, well, it's just a description of Jesus walking by. Well, on one level it is, okay? But on another level, when John says Jesus passed by, that's an indicator, believe it or not, that Jesus is God. Because if we go back to the Old Testament, there are a couple of references of God passing by. So when John tells us Jesus passed by, it's another indicator in John's gospel that Jesus is God. Because again, the main theme of John's gospel is to bring out the divinity of Christ, to put forth the fact that Jesus is divine, he is God. And John does that in a number of different ways. The I am statements. And here's another way. Jesus passed by. In the Old Testament, God passed by Hence, Jesus is God. Now, if you're asking, what instances in the Old Testament records the fact that God passed by? Well, if we go back into the book of Exodus, chapters 33, 34, in reference to Moses, God puts Moses, Moses wants to see God, right? And God puts Moses in the cleft of the rock. And he says, okay, I'm going to put you in the cleft of the rock. You're to look away as my glory passes by. We see it again when God tells in 1 Kings, where God tells Elijah to stand on the mountain as God passes by, accompanied by wind and an earthquake and fire. And we see it again in the book of Job, when Job mentioned God passes by, yet he's unseen. So a couple of instances where we have God passing by. Now John records Jesus passed by, hence an indication once again that Jesus is God. So when you hear that passed by, don't just think, well, it's just a way of describing Jesus walking by. It goes a lot deeper than that. It's another indicator that Jesus is divine. He's God, okay? Another thing that sometimes goes unnoticed or people have questions on is the disciples. Here's this man that's born blind. Okay. Now again, he's born blind. He doesn't have sight, and then at some point in time in his life he becomes blind. He's born blind. So the disciples ask, who sinned? Was it him or his parents? Because the disciples are saying, well, the guy was born blind, and they're surmising that there must be some reason. And the reason is he must have sinned, but if he was born this way, it must have been a case of his parents sinning. Now the question becomes, well, why would the disciples equate this guy's blindness with either him sinning or his parents sinning? Okay, the reason is that there was a thought process among some of the Jews where things such as blindness, okay, they came upon a person because either that person sinned, or in this case, when the man was born blind, his parents must have sinned. So, maladies, diseases, they come upon a person because of that person's sin or their parents' sin, some generational type thing. That was a thinking of among some of the Jews. And Jesus quickly, if you look at the passage, quickly disabuses them of that thinking and says, well, neither he sinned. His blindness is not because he sinned. His blindness is not because his parents sinned. His blindness is not a result of sin. Quite the opposite. It's a case where the glory of God can be revealed. And it is when Jesus heals him of his blindness. So, when you hear Jesus passed by, now we have a little deeper meaning about what's behind the passing by. When we hear the disciples say, his blindness, was it a question of his sin or his parents' sin? Why would they equate it with sin? Now we have kind of an understanding of that. And then we get to the healing itself. Very curious, because in other instances, we see Jesus healing just by a word, or we see Jesus healing from a distance. This healing is a lot more, shall we say, up close and personal, okay? He spits on the ground, makes some clay with his saliva, and then smears it on the man's eyes, tells the guy to wash in the pool of Siloam. The guy does, and his blindness is cured. He can heal. And a lot of times you'll say, boy, this is kind of a weird deal. Here Jesus is spitting on the ground. He's making, clay with the saliva, and he's smearing it on the guy's eyes. Now, again, everything Jesus does is intentional. He does it for a reason. So knowing that, we've got to ask, well, of all the different ways Jesus could have healed this guy, okay, why did he choose this particular way? Spitting on the ground, making clay with the saliva, putting it on the guy's eyes. What's behind all of that? Well, a couple of things. Number one, It's an up-close and personal healing, okay? Jesus is applying this concoction that he's just made with his saliva and the dirt on the ground. He's applying this concoction to the man's eyes. It's very close and very personal, and Jesus, in applying it to the guy's eyes, is using the sense of touch, okay? Couple of meanings behind that. Number one, it indicates on one level that Jesus wants a personal relationship with us, and he wants us to have a personal relationship with him. So one of the reasons behind this up-close and personal style of healing here is it signifies the up-close and personal relationship Jesus wants to have with us, okay? On another level, it also indicates, now remember, the guy is blind, right? So when Jesus applies the concoction to his eyes, the guy knows what Jesus is doing, okay? Because, again, the guy doesn't have his sense of sight, but he does still have his sense of touch. So it's an indication of Jesus, what he's doing is going to be in regards to the man's eyes. And since his eyes are blind, it gives the indication that Jesus is about to do something about that blindness. The other reason is he spits on the ground, right? Now, if you go back to Genesis, when Adam and Eve commit original sins, and God is indicating the punishments Adam is going to have, the punishments Eve is going to have, and he curses the serpent. One of the punishments Adam is going to have is, the ground is going to bring up thorns and thistles. So the ground bringing up thorns and thistles is one of the results of original sin, right? And one of the results of original sin is now man can suffer, man is going to suffer diseases, man is going to suffer death. So when he spits on the ground and heals the guy, it's one way of saying Jesus is going to overcome the consequences, the results of original sin, okay? So a couple of different meanings behind this curious and very up-close and personal style of healing. This Jesus chooses to heal this guy. The other aspect of this is once he puts this concoction on the man's eyes, he tells the man, go to the pool of Siloam, wash the concoction off, and he'll be able to see, okay? Go to the pool of Siloam. Now, Siloam means sent. And again, John chapter 3:16, God so loved the world that he sent his only son, all right? So by telling the guy to wash in the pool of sent, so to speak, S-E-N-T, the pool of Siloam, that's another way of John indicating Jesus is that Son of God that was sent by the Father, okay, to provide redemption and salvation for the world. He tells the guy to go. What does the guy do? He obeys Jesus. Jesus says, go and wash. The guy goes and washes, and as a result, he is healed, okay? Now, we then launch into the rest of the passage where there's a number of different groups of people that have a number of different responses and reactions to this guy, right? On the one hand, you've got the neighbors. On the other hand, you've got the guy's parents. On the other hand, you've got the Jewish religious leaders, right? And it's interesting to look at all three, at the reactions of each of these three groups of people, okay? Now, again, it's kind of beyond the scope of this podcast to really do a deep dive into each of the three reactions, right? But let's take the neighbor's reaction, okay? Let's take that group and kind of unpack them within the confines of our time limit here. When the guy comes back and he can see now, the neighbors have interesting reactions. Some of the neighbors say, this is the same guy, right? He used to be blind, now he can see, right? Other neighbors say, no, it's not the same guy. It looks like him because this guy can see, the guy we know couldn't see. So it can't be the same guy because he was born blind. So it has to be somebody that looks like the same guy. And the reason I choose the neighbor's reaction to bring out in this particular podcast is, when we surrender our lives to Christ, when we come to Christ, right? When we take him as our Lord and Savior, right? We should change. We should be different. As St. Paul says in many cases, we should put off the old man and put on the new man, right? We should be different after coming to Christ than we were before we came to Christ. There should be a difference in us, right? And it's interesting because a lot of times, when a person that wasn't a believer and follower of Christ, when he comes to Christ and his lifestyle changes, his behavior changes, the way he speaks changes, the way he looks at things changes, the way he treats people changes, he's different, right? And people ask, well, what happened? You're different. You used to be this way and now you're this way. People that view people after they come to Christ, they say, you're different now. Well, in point of fact, they better be different, right? And that reaction that people have today about people that have come to Christ, that they're different now, right? That stems back to this guy after he was healed, right? People say, no, okay, this guy's different, right? He can see now, whereas before he was blind. Some people say, well, no, he's the same guy, he's just different. Other people think he's a different guy. So there's this guy comes across as being different after his healing than he was before to his neighbors, just like people that come to Christ come off as being different, or should be, to their neighbors than they were before they came to Christ. So I thought I'd bring the neighbor's reaction out to kind of underscore that. Now, the other thing that these reactions come up is, in each case, right, it shows what Jesus indicated. Because there was a point in his public ministry where people say, where Jesus says, I've come not to bring peace, but to bring division, okay? When Joseph and Mary presented Jesus at the temple, all right, they were told this child is going to be a sign of contradiction to people. He's going to be the result of the rising and falling of many people, right? So, Christ brings a very, there's a very distinct dividing line. You're either for him or you're against him. Jesus even says, those that are not for me are against me. So the fact that Jesus is a source of division, do you believe in him and follow him or not, that division, that different reaction to Jesus is brought out in the different reactions these people have, right? And and the reactions in some of them, they're attributed to his neighbors, his fellow man. Another group of people that have a reaction are his parents, okay? So oftentimes, the division can come from outside one's household or even inside one's household. Now, as regards to the household, let me say a few words about how his parents react, because I think that's instructive. Because if you look at all the verses and you look at the back and forth between all of these people, the Pharisees, they want to try and convince people that that this guy really wasn't blind, because again, if he was blind and Jesus healed him, they don't want to admit to that. So the only way they can think of in terms of discrediting this miracle, this healing, is by taking the tack that, well, this guy really wasn't healed. He wasn't given his sight because he wasn't blind in the first place. So at one point in this conversation, they go to his parents, right? And they say, hey, is this your son? And the parents say yes. And, they question his parents, and they say, well, what do you have to say about his healing? All right. What do you have to say about him gaining his sight? And the parents respond in a very curious manner. They seem to kind of throw their son under the bus. They seem to kind of they have a chance to defend him, but they don't, right? Because the guy's saying, Jesus healed me, Jesus gave me his sight. So when they give the parents a chance to back their son up and say, yes, he's right, Jesus did heal our son, Jesus did give him his sight, the parents distance themselves from it. They kind of throw him under the bus. They say, yeah, this is our son, but in terms of how he gained his sight and who healed him, hey, he's of age, he's a grown man, ask him, right? Well, then the question has always come up, well, God, that's a terrible that's a terrible stance for the parents to take. This is their son. He's been given his sight. It's a wonderful thing. And the parents, rather than backing their son up and confirming that Jesus was the one that healed him, they basically distance themselves from the whole thing, right? And they say, well, ask him. He's a grown man. And you might say, well, why would the parents do this? Are they just bad people? Do they not really like their son? Well, if you read the passage, John inserts the reason why the parents didn't back up their son, why they seem to throw their son under the bus and distance themselves, is because they were afraid that if they admitted that Jesus was the Messiah and that Jesus healed their son, if they admitted that like their son did, then that would go against what the Jewish religious leaders believed, and as a result, they would be excommunicated, they would be thrown out of the temple. And the temple and the ability to worship in it and to offer sacrifices in it, that meant everything to a Jewish person. So to run the risk of being thrown out of the temple, of being excommunicated from the temple, that was one of the worst things that could happen to you. Because not only would you not be able to worship and offer sacrifices, you would be ostracized by all your neighbors, right? So that was one of the worst things that could happen to a Jewish person, is to be thrown out of the temple. And the parents reasoned that, look, if we agree with our son and confirm the fact that Jesus is the Messiah and he healed the son, then we're going to be thrown out of the temple and our lives are going to change forever. So rather than risk that for themselves, that's why they distance themselves from their son and what he's saying. That's why they seem to throw their son under the bus and say, hey, he's a grown man. He can speak for themselves, all right? They want to save their own skin rather than siding with the truth, siding with their son. So again, another reaction of they didn't want to be canceled, using modern parlance. They didn't want to be canceled religiously and societally. So rather than run the risk of being canceled, they deny Jesus being the Messiah, and they kind of distance themselves from it. So without going into the verse-by-verse unpacking of the reactions of these three people, the fact that they have reactions and that they're different reactions underscores the fact that people have different reactions to Jesus, right? And that when a person comes to Jesus, that will evoke different reactions from people. So again, like I said, not necessarily a verse-by-verse unpacking of this gospel, but some aspects that are contained in the gospel that maybe we really didn't put much emphasis on before. Maybe we really didn't actually hear before. Or if we heard it, we didn't really understand the deeper significance and deeper meaning. And hopefully, if I've done a halfway decent job, I've brought some of that deeper significance and deeper meaning into John says Jesus passes by. The disciples saying who sinned, him or his parents. The very curious and up-close manner in which Jesus heals the guy. The different reactions people have after the healing versus before in terms of how the neighbors view this guy. So when you hear the actual verses themselves proclaimed, put those verses themselves against a backdrop and background that we developed today, and hopefully it'll bring those verses, it'll give them a little bit more meaning and give you a little bit more insight into the verses themselves. So with that, as always, Max is kindly showing me the monitor, the counter here. Not too bad for a 41-verse reading. So with that, have a blessed, continue to have a blessed Lenten season. Have a blessed fourth Sunday of Lent, a blessed Laetare Sunday. And until the fifth Sunday of Lent, I'm Charles Merritt, and from the campus of St. Bonaventure High School, take care and God bless.